You are sitting in a parking garage on the fourth level when your phone buzzes. It's a text from a number that hasn't existed for 3 weeks. It says clean. One word. That's the whole debrief. You put the phone down on the passenger seat and watch the concrete pillar in front of you for a long time. The fluorescent light overhead flickers once and holds. Somewhere below, a car door closes. Footsteps. Then silence. The man who trusted you more than anyone in his professional life is currently being processed at a federal detention facility 6 miles from where you're sitting. His wife doesn't know yet. His daughter, who is 9 years old and draws horses on everything, the backs of envelopes, the margins of her homework, the inside covers of library books, she doesn't know yet. And you are the reason. But that's the middle of the story. Let's go back to the beginning. The file comes across on a Wednesday. Your handler slides it over the table in a diner off Route 9 and orders a second coffee before you've opened it. That's how you know it's serious. When it's routine, he waits for you to read first. The name in the file is Marcus Vale. The photograph shows a man in his mid-40s, unremarkable in the way that men who are careful about being unremarkable always are. Salt and pepper at the temples. A jacket that costs more than it looks. Eyes that are doing math on something off-camera. Your handler tells you Marcus runs a private logistics company that moves things across 3 international borders. The company is real. The clients are real. The compliance certifications are real. What isn't real is what moves through certain corridors at certain times in certain containers that don't appear on the manifests. Your handler tells you what those containers have been holding. He tells you what happened at the other end of a shipment 14 months ago. He slides a second photograph across the table. You look at it for 3 seconds and then you look away. He says, "We need someone inside." You say, "Okay." What he doesn't tell you, what he can't, because the file is still being built, is that one of the people inside Marcus's orbit is there without knowing what orbit she's in. That comes later. First, you have to become someone who would be useful to him. You spend 4 weeks building the cover before you make a single approach. The name is Evan Carver. Evan is a former mid-level compliance officer at a freight brokerage in Cincinnati who got pushed out in a quiet restructuring 18 months ago. He has a consulting website with 6 pages of content, 2 testimonials from Shell addresses, and a client list that checks out to 3 levels of verification. He has a LinkedIn going back 6 years with carefully spaced activity. The rhythm of a real person who thinks about his professional profile twice a year and no more. He has a grudge about regulatory capture that he mentions once and doesn't repeat. He has a very specific working knowledge of how bonded warehouse documentation gets stretched across jurisdictions without technically breaking the rules. That knowledge is real. You earn it. You spend 11 days reading industry publications, tariff schedules, and CBP enforcement bulletins until you can talk for 40 minutes about documentation compliance without consulting anything. You build Evan the way you'd build a load-bearing wall. Nothing decorative, everything structural. You do not learn to be charming. You learn to be useful. Charm fades. Utility keeps a door open. First contact happens at a trade association dinner in Baltimore. You engineer a seat 2 places from Marcus at a table that spends 40 minutes discussing port congestion at the Port of Baltimore and the downstream effects on bonded warehouse capacity. You don't speak to him directly. You speak to the man between you, and you say something precise about CBP examination queues and the specific documentation gap that creates dwell time liability that makes Marcus turn his head. He asks a clarifying question. You answer it with one additional detail he didn't ask for. The kind of detail that only someone who has actually sat inside a compliance dispute would know. You do not oversell. You let the information be the thing. He hands you a card at the end of the evening. The card has only a phone number on it. No name, no title, no company. You file that detail in the part of your brain that stores things that matter. You call the number 8 days later, not sooner. 8 days is the interval that says, "I've been thinking about whether this is worth my time, and I've decided it is, but I'm not desperate." Marcus picks up on the second ring. He remembers exactly what you said at the dinner. Not approximately, exactly. You talk for 11 minutes. He asks if you're available for a face-to-face about a compliance question he's been working through. You say you have some availability in the next 2 weeks. He says next Thursday. You say Thursday works. The meeting is at his office in a converted warehouse space near the waterfront. The building has two entry points that you clock before you go inside and a loading dock at the rear. The office has three people in it besides Marcus, a woman at a desk near the window who is not an assistant because no assistant watches a room the way she watches a room. A man by the back wall whose shoulders are oriented toward the door rather than toward the phone he's pretending to read. And someone in a glass-walled side office making a call that ends precisely when you enter. You count the exits without looking like you're counting the exits. You take the chair Marcus offers. You sit so your back is not entirely to the room. You talk for 2 hours. Marcus is careful in the way that careful people are. He asks questions that seem like conversation but are structured tests. He describes a specific Port Authority arbitration process and embeds a technical error in the description. Not a large error, a small one, the kind that a person who learned this from reading would miss, and a person who learned it from doing would catch. You catch it. You correct it in the same tone you've been using for everything else without flagging it as a correction. He relaxes 3 degrees, barely visible in the set of his shoulders, but there. He offers you a project, an assessment of documentation processes for a new shipping corridor he's developing. He names a number. The number is generous. You say you'll review the scope document and get back to him within 48 hours. He says he appreciates people who don't say yes before they understand what they're saying yes to. You drive back and sit at your kitchen table, your real kitchen table, in your real apartment, under your real name. And you write everything down in the encrypted system your handler gave you. And you try, before you close the laptop, to remember the last time someone said something to you that was also genuinely true. The small project leads to a second. The second leads to access to the internal logistics data your handler has been trying to reach for 7 months. But something else is building at the same time, and your handler doesn't know about it, and you don't report it, which is its own kind of decision. Over the course of 6 weeks, you have eaten lunch with Marcus 4 times. You have been to his office 11 times. You have met his business partner, a quiet man named Theo, who repairs old analog radios on weekends and keeps a row of photographs of his grandchildren along the front edge of his desk. 4 kids between the ages of 2 and 7 in various stages of being photographed. You have learned that Marcus built his first business at 23 with a loan his mother co-signed when no bank would touch him. You have learned that when she died 3 years ago, he bought her house back from the estate at above market price just to make sure it stayed in one piece and didn't get converted. You have learned that Marcus has a line he doesn't cross regarding certain people, and that the line is real, even if the line is not in the right place. You have learned that he is not a good man in every respect. You have also learned that he is not only the thing your handler's file says he is. And those 2 facts sit in your chest like a weight that doesn't resolve into anything simple. The warning arrives on a Tuesday. You show up for a scheduled meeting, and the woman near the window, her name is Sandra, you've learned over weeks of slow, careful attention, looks at you 2 seconds longer than her usual interval when you walk in. Not with suspicion, with something more precise than suspicion. With the expression of someone who is recalibrating a measurement they thought they'd already taken. You file it. You do not flag it to your handler in the next report. You tell yourself it's nothing. You tell yourself that for every remaining day of the operation. And you're not certain, then or now, whether that silence was tradecraft or something you don't have a clean word for. 3 weeks after that Tuesday, Marcus calls a meeting that isn't on the calendar. When you arrive, the room has 4 people in it instead of the usual 2. Theo is there. Sandra is there. A third man you haven't seen before stands near the far window with his arms at his sides, and the specific stillness of how he's standing. Weight evenly distributed, no restless movement, eyes that are doing an inventory of the room every 90 seconds. Tells you he has been in rooms like this before, for the same general purpose. The door closes. You do not look at the door. Marcus looks at you and says he needs to discuss something sensitive. You keep your face exactly where it has been. He says he has a concern about a document discrepancy in the corridor assessment you submitted 3 weeks ago. A real discrepancy, not planted, not a test. A genuine error from the 3rd week of the operation during a 36-hour stretch when you were running 2 simultaneous cover obligations and your concentration was 2 degrees off. Your handler flagged it. You were told it had been resolved at the source level before it could surface. It was not resolved. Marcus places 2 documents on the table. He doesn't slide them. He places them with a deliberateness that tells you he's been sitting with this for some time. He watches your hands while he does it. You look at both documents. You give yourself 7 seconds, long enough to appear to be reading carefully, not long enough to appear to be managing a response. You tell him you see the discrepancy. You tell him you think you know exactly where it came from. You walk him through the third-party data source that introduced the error at the input stage, step by step, in the correct sequence, with the specific file reference number you kept in memory for the possibility of exactly this conversation. You explain it the way a person explains something that irritated them at the time and still does, with the specific texture of low-grade professional annoyance rather than the texture of someone who has been practicing. Sandra is watching your hands. Theo is watching your eyes. The man near the window has not moved. Marcus looks at you for a long time after you finish. Then he nods. He says, "I wanted to hear it from you directly. You say you appreciate that." The man near the window leaves the room without being asked. The meeting continues. But you know now that you are running the rest of this operation on borrowed time, and the interest accrues daily. The impossible part comes 9 days before the scheduled end. Your handler calls a debrief and tells you something that isn't in any file you've been shown. One of the secondary individuals in Marcus's network, a woman named Claire, who manages invoice documentation and who you have spoken to exactly 3 times in the course of this operation, is not a knowing participant. She has been moving fraudulent documents inside shipments she believes are entirely legitimate, routed through her accounts by Theo, who is her father-in-law, and who she trusts entirely because she has no reason not to. She doesn't know. She has a husband and 2 children. If the operation proceeds as scheduled, she will be taken in with the others. The charge against her would likely be reduced at the prosecutorial stage, but it would not disappear. She would lose her position. The business she and her husband operate together, which carries a joint credit line, would be called. Your handler tells you this is a prosecutorial determination outside your operational scope. He tells you the operation proceeds Thursday at 7:30 a.m. You drive to the parking garage, 4th level. You sit for 40 minutes and you do the math. If you escalate the question about Claire to someone above your handler, the operation pauses for review. A pause of even 5 days means Marcus moves the next corridor shipment before the intercept team is in position. Your handler has been working toward that specific shipment for 11 months. The material in it is documented. The harm it would cause is documented. It is not abstract. If the operation proceeds on Thursday, Claire spends the next several years navigating a federal case she didn't enter knowingly, and a 9-year-old girl who draws horses grows up with the particular shape of that damage built into the structure of her life. You sit there and you think about Marcus buying his mother's house back to keep it standing. You think about Theo's grandchildren on the desk. You think about the photograph your handler showed you in the diner, the one you looked at for 3 seconds and then looked away from. You think about all of it for 40 minutes. Then you call your handler. You say, "Thursday." He says, "Good." You don't say anything else. You don't know, then or now, whether you made the right call or whether you made the call that was available to you and called it right. Thursday. The intercept team is staged at 3 points across a 2-mile perimeter. You are inside the building when they move at 7:42 a.m. Your role is to keep Marcus in the main office and away from the secondary communications array in the glass-walled side room until the team is through the external door, a window of approximately 4 minutes. You do this by opening a conversation about a new corridor development you've been building material on for exactly this purpose. Real data, a real opportunity structure, something Marcus would genuinely want to hear. You watch him lean forward over the table. You watch the calculation in his eyes shift from general engagement to specific interest. You watch him decide to believe you, which is a decision you can see a person make if you've watched enough people make it. That is the part that costs something you don't have a name for and have not been able to name since. The team comes through the door. Marcus turns toward the sound and then turns back toward you, and in the 2 seconds between those movements, you see him arrive at the answer. Not the what, the who. He looks at you for 1 full second without speaking. His face doesn't do anything dramatic. It does something much smaller and much harder to look at. Then the room is full of voices and movement and instruction, and he doesn't look at you again. Claire is not arrested. Your handler does not explain how that was arranged. You do not ask. Marcus receives 16 years. Theo receives 8. The corridor shipment is interdicted at the border 4 days later. The material is exactly what the file said it was. The harm at the other end of it doesn't happen. That is documented. That is verified. That is true. You go back to your apartment. You sit on the couch, and you wait for the shape of things to settle into something you can carry forward. It doesn't settle. What keeps coming back is not the operation in the large sense. It's that 2-second interval when Marcus turned away from the door and back towards you and understood. The specific way a person looks when the thing they built their trust on turns out to be load-bearing in a different direction than they thought. You did what was necessary. The material was real. The harm was real, and it didn't happen. All of that is true. You tell yourself that. You tell yourself that in the apartment, in the parking garage, in every quiet place you sit in when you're waiting for the weight to find its final position. It doesn't find it. What you know is that you were good at being Evan Carver. You know that because when Marcus looked at you in that last second, he wasn't looking at a federal agent working an operation. He was looking at someone he had made a decision to trust. And you don't know. You have turned this over more times than you can count, and you genuinely do not know whether those two things were ever, at any point, actually different.